title of the Torah portion is Chukat. Say that with me, Chukat. Who got that? Numbers chapter 19, verse 1 through chapter 22. And it's got several notable events. If you've read, how many of you have read this Torah portion in your life? You know, that can kind of get you off the hook because probably didn't read it this week. Well, you know, it talks about Moshe striking the rock twice. It also gives us a little bit of a dissertation about how Edom refuses to allow Israel to pass through their land. You have the death of Aaron and Miriam. And then you have fiery serpents attacking Israel. And you have, last but not least, you have the conquest of Og of Bashan, who was one of the giants in the land. And I believe with what Shepherd John was saying, I am firmly convinced that we're going to see literal physical giants in the land again. We're going to have to stand against those enemies that are going to be unleashed out of the pit, and you better be prepared. If you don't know who your Messiah is, you're going to have a difficult time. But if you're like King David, you can gather up those stones to annihilate the ancestor of the giants that's going to be coming against you. But what I would like to focus on in this particular Torah portion that's entitled Chukat is one particular avenue that I believe is central to our understanding what Abba's role in allowing the Messiah to come down and take on the cloak, or if you will, or the flesh of a man, and then walk out some things that you see manifested in the natural throughout the wilderness sacrificial system. And one of those is the red heifer, the Chukat, or the statute of the red heifer. The sages teach that this ordinance of the red heifer is literally a degree or a decree beyond our understanding. And in Hebrew, that word for red heifer is parah adumah. Say that with me, parah adumah. Before we get too far into the red heifer specifically, I'd just like to look at the title portion and look at that word in the Hebrew, the word chukat. And it's interesting because it comes from a word that is plural, chukah, and that comes from the root stem, the word chok, and it means a statute, an ordinance, something that is appointed. It actually originates from a word that indicates to cut out, to reach in and surgically remove something so that you've left something else in its place, to inscribe, to engrave. And while you're doing that, you're setting something in motion or setting something up that will be used to govern. And it's not an accident because verse 10 of this particular Torah portion tells us that this particular chukot, this ordinance or statute of the red heifer, is an ordinance or a statute forever. Now, if you just take that on its face value, then it would lead you to believe, and the rabbis, and we'll touch this probably several times throughout the Torah portion, the rabbis believe that there have been 9 red heifers throughout history since Moshe slaughtered the first one. There's been 9 physical red heifers slaughtered for their purpose in the tabernacle setting, the temple setting, and yet there's a 10th one that's coming, and that the Messiah that arrives on the scene will slaughter the 10th one. And so I have to ask you, if in fact this is a statute forever, and we know that the wilderness sacrificial system was a temporal or a temporary system until Father could set in place the spiritual representation of that system, then do we really in fact need another red heifer to be slaughtered? I want you to keep that in your mind. And there are a lot of individuals that would say, when they hear me talking about this ordinance of the red heifer, first of all, not understanding the physical symbology behind it, then they won't understand its spiritual application. And a lot of our church brothers would be quick to tell you that the law's been done away with. We don't have to keep the law now. But yet they'll go over in Galatians chapter 3 around verse 13 and talk about being seed of Abraham. And yet in Genesis chapter 26, we're told that Abraham, long before Moshe arrived on the scene, that Abraham kept the mitzvot, the chukat, and the law, the Torah. He kept the commandments, he kept the statutes, and he kept the law, the Torah, long before we arrived at this particular event here at Mount Sinai. And so it seems as if there's an exposing that's being allowed to take place in that group that calls themselves believers today, so that we can pull back all of the religious fluff and excavate this thing down to the bare bones or to the bedrock so that we can see exactly what we're standing on. Because if you go back and read the New Testament example or the parable that Yeshua shared about the 2 men that built their house. One built his house on sand, the other man built his house on a solid rock. If you go back and just read that, you'll find that they both had the same vision. They evidently both had the same resources, because we're also told, how can you build a house or wage war without first counting the cost? And so it's evident that both of them had the means to do so, and both of them had the same materials and tools, and yet one built his own sand, which was shift, and the other one built his own bedrock. And I would have to ask you then, what is your house being built on? And there's a lot of our family members, a lot of our friends, a lot of Messianic Christian Hebrew roots teachers out there that are teaching things that, in my opinion, and I believe that truth will stand scrutiny. And so I don't mind you calling me on what I'm sharing with you, as long as you are digging down yourself and you have an informed opinion. But what I'm trying to share is that there's a lot of fluff that's been taught that I think Father's exposing in this season that we're living in. Do you believe that? I believe it. Now, the rabbis say that this word, the root of this word, chukat, this word chok, is something that's incomprehensible. In other words, the mind of man can't even understand it. And they go so far to say that even Solomon, with all the wisdom that Solomon had, couldn't understand it. They say that it's an ordinance that exists specifically for one reason, and that's to test your obedience. How many of you have been tested lately? How many of you have been obedient to what you have been tested on? How many of you have heard a word from Abba, and yet you have procrastinated and have not moved, and you're just waiting on a confirmation? It's an ordinance that exists to test one's obedience simply because Abba said to do it. I find that there is some wisdom by times in testing the voices. But if you need more than 3 or 4 or 5 witnesses to give you a foundation for you to launch out on when you've heard from Abba, then I would suggest you need to back up and punt. You need to go back and find out, first of all, if you heard the voice or not. And maybe you did hear a voice, but you're just procrastinating. Procrastinators get left behind. Now, regarding these chukot, these ordinances that require strict obedience, it's in my opinion, you see an example of this here in the Torah, because Moshe's instructed how to deal with this rock from which the living water would issue forth. And he's told initially to strike the rock. This time he's told to speak to it, but instead what does he do? He strikes the rock twice. This was a command that was given him that did require strict obedience without question, and yet it results in Moshe, because of all of the stuff that's going around, and I'm quite sure, and if you go back and look at it, Moshe actually tries later on to blame the people. Because of you, God was angry with me. How many of you tried the blame game lately? It's your fault that where I'm at. Well, I don't think so. It results in Moshe striking the rock twice in anger. And as a result, both he and Aaron receive a death penalty for their disobedience. Listen to that. This is not something to play with, because from what I understand, obedience or not is the difference between life or death. Are you hearing me? And so you have to ask yourself, is there a deeper connection in this Torah portion rather than just something we go back and look that's antiquated regarding the ashes of a red heifer? And I understand all of the mechanism behind it. I understand the science behind it. If you really do your due diligence, I was raised in the South. I understand what cleansing agents are. My grandmother used to make lye soap from ashes and water that was run through the ashes, and it had a caustic agent that was left behind, and she would make the soap. It's a cleansing agent. And so the ashes of the red heifer, literally as those ashes were taken and water was run through it with hyssop, these things literally become a caustic agent, sort of like a lye soap that would actually cleanse you from certain germs and things that you would come in contact with. That's the physical application. I understand that. But there has to be something far more than that. And I believe that as we look into this Torah portion, you're going to see some things regarding this statute, something that the natural mind cannot understand. And so you're going to have to look at this thing purely from a spiritual perspective. Are you listening? And as I was sitting here at my desk looking at it, I looked at the word chukat and the numeric value, which is 508, and I found that it was closely related to another word that had the same numeric value. And if you Sometimes I get castigated because I talk about numeric values and the gematria and, oh, you're a Kabbalist or you're involved in some of this mystical stuff. No, Hebrew is an alphanumeric language. Yahweh did that, not me. And so if I have a letter or a word that has a specific numeric value and there's another letter or another word or a combination of the two that have the same values, then Abba's the one, his mind and his thoughts, his ways are higher than ours, and he put those there for a reason, just like the word for Nakash and the word for Mashiach, 358, same numeric values. How are they related? Well, one is an archetype or a counterfeit of the other. And so if you understand this, you can kind of put things in their proper context. Well, this word Chukat comes from a root word that I found with the same value all the way back in Genesis chapter 3, verse 24. And when you're studying the scriptures, if you remember, the law of first reference is something that you can go back and put a nail in when you're trying to study and find out, what does this word mean? Where's the definition originate from? Well, let me go back and find the place that this word is first used, and I put a nail over here in Genesis chapter 3, verse 24, and so I go back to where I pegged this word garash at first, and I find, okay, this kind of sets a precedent for how I should treat this word from this time throughout the rest of the Torah. And then if you look at it within the frame of context, because if you don't understand context, if you don't have context with context, you have pretext, okay? And so context helps to give you definition. And so this word garash, which you see back in Genesis chapter 3, verse 24, actually is translated into King James English as to drive out, to expel. It can be translated as divorce, to drive out from a specific possession. And so it's no doubt, in my opinion, and I believe that this is a studied opinion, not just something I've heard someone else say, and so I'm echoing that. We have a lot of people standing in platforms today that are just an echo. Are you listening? But if you look deeper, you have to remember in Genesis chapter 3 that Adam and Eve, Adam and Chava, at this particular season, they represented the bride of Yahweh in the earth. And after the fall, they are found in what we know today as an unclean condition. And the reason that they are unclean is, first of all, they came in contact with the dead one. Listening to me? They actually contracted death. Listen to that word, contracted death. They engaged in a covenant contract with the dead one, and so because of that, death came on them, and it was passed forth down to all of the subsequent generations of the Adam until the day that our Messiah steps up and steps into the place of that dead one called the Adam. That last Adam becomes the living man, and he breaks that contract that we had with death. And so here you see that they have contracted death. And this is a specific reason that the red heifer ordinance was set in motion, is so that it could be used as a cleansing agent for all of those individuals that would have been tainted by having come in contact with a dead corpse. Listen to me. If you had to bury a loved one, guess what? You came in contact with death. You had to apply the red heifer ashes. That ritual cleansing had to be applied to you so that you could be cleansed and then have access to the temple. You could go about if you didn't intend on going into the temple or the wilderness tabernacle, then you didn't have to come in contact with it. It was so that you could be clean in order to come into the sanctuary of the Most High. Think about that. But if you did not go through the means of ritual cleansing with this red heifer offering, this red heifer sacrifice, then not only were you denied access to the sanctuary where the presence of the Creator would reside, but you would also be cut off forever from the house of Israel. Now you need to think about this. If these don't have merit to us today, then why is that important? Okay? And I'm convinced that Adam and Chava, not only were they guilty of coming in contact with the dead one, but something transpired in addition to that, just being in the area where you reach out and touch, because she touches the dead one. And then they engage in sexual perversion with this entity, this Nakash, whatever you want to call him here at the tree of carnal knowledge, and they are also now guilty of adultery. And it's not an accident that from a Torah perspective, adultery requires a death penalty. Isn't that amazing? Now, let me just share this with you. It is my personal opinion, and again, it's not just something I pull out of the hat. This is something that I've studied for years. I believe that every precept regarding our relationship with the Creator, everything that has to do with the redemptive process that was, I believe, foreshadowed in all of the sacrificial elements of the wilderness tabernacle, all of those things you can find first typed, if you will, or typified, including this ordinance of the red heifer all the way back here in Genesis. Now that's a sobering statement. We'll look at it and you'll see what I'm talking about. So, based on what I've shared with you thus far, we can reckon that the act of adultery is actually related to touching the dead or touching the dead one. And if you go study ancient Near Eastern cultures, you'll find that if the husband whose wife had been guilty of adultery, he could actually have her killed, but if he decides, instead of having her killed, if he decides he's going to divorce her, instead of having the death penalty applied, then it required a forfeiture of the wife's ketubah, or the wedding vows that they had shared together, and all of the promises that he had promised her prior to their getting married. Now they're abrogated, they're broken. Now remember that. Adam and Eve come in contact with the dead one. Adam and Eve commit adultery. Adam and Eve had a ketubah. Adam and Eve had a wedding covenant contract with the Creator in Genesis chapter 1 and chapter 2, and that is abrogated in chapter 3. From that time forward until there's someone who makes a propitiation for that, to rectify that, they have no ketubah. They have no wedding covenant. The promises have been disavowed. Does that make sense to you? It puts you in a compromising position. You hear what I'm saying? Now, again, as I was sharing earlier, another thing that's peculiar to this red heifer ordinance is that its ashes are necessary to allow access to the tabernacle of Yahweh. And based on what we've shared with you in the past, I believe personally, again, that the wilderness tabernacle was actually laid out, designed, if you will, in the form of a man. And so the wilderness tabernacle, in effect, represented the dead Adam. The dead Adam laying on the earth, and this dead Adam, from that time forward until the Messiah comes, he is in need of a continual cleansing until such time as the living last Adam could present a tabernacle, this tabernacle, not made with hands. Does that make sense? And you were part of that living tabernacle, the living stones tabernacle. And until the body of Messiah is presented in the earth, then that death that had worked through the Adam and all of Adam's generations had not been conquered. That's why when Yeshua comes, you hear the cry of victory. Oh, death, where's your sting? Grave, where's your victory? Why? Because Yeshua broke that death sting off of us. But I submit to you that even though the wilderness tabernacle no longer stands, and we understand that there is in fact a spiritual tabernacle that's being built, and Peter calls you a living stone that is set upon the foundational stone of Messiah, and we are that living stones tabernacle. I submit to you that the living stones tabernacle is still in need of a parah adamah, a red heifer. Even though the spiritual tabernacle supplanted the wilderness tabernacle or the temple. And so this kind of presents a conundrum, because if we are in fact in need of a red heifer, back to the proposition that the sages give us, that the Messiah is going to come and offer a 10th red heifer, the red heifer itself is a shadow picture. It's a pattern. And that particular ritual could only be sufficient as a fleshly cleansing agent, and it didn't have the ability to cleanse you from spiritual death. Do you understand what I'm saying? If it did, then all of those that came in contact with the red heifer ashes would have been spiritually clean, and death would not have ever been on them again. Does that make sense? Are you seeing me? So you have to ask yourself, where does this spiritual cleansing agent known as the parah adamah that we're in need of right now, where does that come from? Is it indeed going to be something that happens to us in the future? Is there indeed? And I'll be honest with you, back when we were in Mississippi, we had a relationship with one of the gentlemen that was responsible for raising up red heifers and getting them to Israel, and we watched that very eagerly, and we watched it closely until my eyes began to be open, and I understand what I'm going to share with you before we're through this afternoon. And most people are fixated on that red heifer because you got to have the red heifer to cleanse the place where the temple is going to be built. You got to have the red heifer to cleanse all of those that come in contact with the temple. Okay, if that's the need, then let me ask you this. Why wasn't for the last 2,000 years, when there's been no temple, there's been no red heifer, what happened to all of our Jewish brothers in that short 2,000-year period of time? It's kind of sobering, isn't it? If their salvation actually hinges on these rituals, then it puts them in a pretty serious predicament, doesn't it? Hello? To help you understand this, and I'll be honest with you, as I was sitting at my desk and Abba began to take me in this direction that you're about to see, and I call it a sidebar, it just literally did not make any sense. And it didn't seem as if it fit this Torah portion. You remember I shared with you the word Chukat has a numeric value of 508. And I told you that it had the same numeric value as that word garash or garasha in Genesis chapter 3, verse 24. Remember that? And so I saw that there's such a close relation with those numeric values. It bears going back and scrutinizing and looking at it with a microscope. And if you go back and look at that word garasha, it's quite often mistranslated or misinterpreted because it's closely related to a word that is in Genesis chapter 3, verse 23, and that's that word shalak. And the King James translators, from Genesis all the way to the end in the New Testament, quite often mistranslate this word shalak. And it's important for you to see this. That word shalak is translated as to send out, to send away, to let loose. And as I was saying, the King James translators quite often, more often than not, translate that word as divorce instead of just to send someone away. In fact, it's where you get the root of the word for an apostle, a shalak, a sent one. And I want to give you a couple of verses for you to consider before we go too much further. And you can see that there in Genesis chapter 3. It says, "Therefore Yahweh Elohim sent Shalak, him, the Adam, forth from the Garden of Eden, and he sent him forth to till the ground from whence he was taken. So he drove out." Well, this is not the word Shalak here, it's the word Garash. He drove out the man, and he placed at the east of the Garden of Eden cherubims and a flaming sword which turned every way to keep the way of the tree of life. Now, Yahweh does not mince words. And so I want you to understand what's about to transpire here, because when you look at these two words together, Shalak versus Garash, they're usually presented to you almost interchangeably. And yet, they are very seldom seen, like you just saw here in verse 23 and 24, they're very seldom seen coupled together. When they are seen coupled together in the context that you're going to see in a few minutes, it's important for you to notice, and I'll give you some examples. I could only find 4. The first one there is what I call the garden expulsion. And then the second was in Genesis chapter 21, where Sarah speaks to Abram and she says, "I want you to shalak garash Hagar." The third instance I found is in Exodus chapter 6, verse 1, where Yahweh speaking to Moshe regarding what is going to transpire with Pharaoh as a result of all of the plagues. He says, Pharaoh is going to shalak garash you. And then finally in Exodus chapter 3, verse 28, when Yahweh tells Moshe and the children of Israel, when you go into the land of Canaan, I'm going to send hornets, and we don't have time. Maybe we could get into that because there's some powerful stuff there. I'm going to send out hornets, and I don't believe it's the little stinging flying insects. I'm going to send out these hornets, and they're going to shalak garash all of the Nephilim, the Hivite, Canaanites, and Hittites that will be there in the land. Now, I want you to pay attention because it's important to see the connection with this word Chukat and this word Garashah. On every other occasion, you see these two words, they're separated and not occurring within the same framework or context. And as I said, and Brittany mentioned this last week, context helps you to determine definition. All right? And so, if I call you a lawless one, then I need to know where law whether it's anomia in the Greek or Torah in the Hebrew, I need to know where that was first used so that I can go back and find out if I am, in fact, lawless. In other words, I'm without Torah or not. Does that make sense to you? Okay. Now, for clarity's sake, this word shalak means to send or to put away, while the word garasha or garash is harsh. It's a term that has finality to it. It's used specifically to emphasize a divorce. But what does garash have to do with this chukat, this ordinance of the red heifer? Hopefully I can answer this for you. Again, after what I've been looking at, it's my opinion that the word shalak is simply a putting away, much like the ancient Near Eastern customs where a man could send his wife away on a whim. If she didn't cook good, you're gone out of here. He would tell her, shalak, get out. Okay? He could do that according to the ancient Near Eastern customs without divorcing her, and therefore, based on that, she was not free to remarry again, and so she was literally, for all intents and purposes, a slave forever to that original contract. The other word, garash, always, without fail, involves the issuing of what we refer to in the Hebrew community as a get, a bill of divorce. And if you were issued a get, a garashah, a bill of divorce, you were lawfully released and thus free to remarry. Now, the church community, and I happen to be a byproduct of a divorce. My first wife walked off and left me with 3 little girls to raise by myself. She walked out and gave me the choice to, either serve Yahweh or it's me, and I had to make the decision. But the reason I'm sharing this with you, I'm trying to frame it within the context of Scripture, because people that have been through divorces have been looked upon as if they had what is an unpardonable stain upon them. Are you listening to me? And the reason for that is because of the simple misinterpretation. Well, I believe this has been intentional. And if you don't understand this, then you'll never understand the purpose of the red heifer's ashes, because if you come in contact with the dead one, you've committed adultery. Are you listening to me? And based on that, you can never be taken in marriage again. So whose bride are you? Are you listening? The issuance of a get, go back and read Deuteronomy chapter 24, verse 1, dissolved the marriage covenant. Without a get, the man or woman who remarried would be illegally married and guilty of adultery. This is why Yahweh both shalaks, Genesis chapter 3, go back and read it. He says he shalaks and garashas. He sends Adam and Eve out, and he issues them a get, a bill of divorce.